The winter fog rolled through Berlin's divided streets like a living thing, carrying secrets between the east and west sectors, where concrete walls and barbed wire had torn a city in half. In the shadowed doorways of crumbling Baroque buildings, men in long coats stood smoking cigarettes that glowed like warning beacons in the darkness, each one wondering if the stranger across the street was watching him or simply trying to survive another frozen night. This was 1978, and Berlin had become the chessboard where superpowers played their most dangerous game, where a misplaced word could mean death and every conversation might be recorded by ears that never slept. The cold. War wasn't cold here, not really. It burned with a slow intensity that consumed careers, marriages, and sometimes lives, all in the name of intelligence that might never be used. Western agencies had flooded the city with cameras, microphones, and observation posts, creating an ocean of surveillance data that threatened to drown the very analysts. Meant to make sense of it, behind reinforced doors and triple-locked gates, intelligence officers hunched over grainy photographs and endless reels of surveillance footage, their eyes burning from hours of frame-by-frame analysis that moved slower than the second hand on a broken watch. The technology was supposed to be cutting-edge, massive. Machines that whirred and clicked with mechanical precision, yet they seemed designed for a different war, a slower conflict where enemies moved predictably and patterns emerged like constellations in a clear sky. Instead, Soviet operatives ghosted through the city with practiced ease, making their dead drops and handler meetings, while Western analysts were still processing footage from 3 weeks prior, always behind, always catching shadows of men who had already vanished. The frustration hung thick as cigarette smoke in every briefing room, the unspoken knowledge that for all their expensive equipment and sophisticated methods, they were losing ground in a city where information was the only currency that mattered. Meanwhile, in the east, beyond checkpoints where young soldiers aimed rifles at their own countrymen, the machinery of Soviet intelligence operated with brutal efficiency, unburdened by the democratic oversight and bureaucratic layers that slowed Western responses to a crawl. Every day brought new reports of compromised operations, burned assets, and networks that collapsed before anyone understood they'd been penetrated, and still the surveillance footage piled higher in storage rooms that smelled of magnetic tape and desperation. Sergeant Michael Drayson wasn't supposed to be in Berlin at all, but the army had a way of sending men where they least expected to go, and his expertise in radio signals had landed him in a cramped listening post that smelled of stale coffee and electrical components burning slowly behind metal panels. He was 26 years old with a technical mind that had earned him top marks in signals training. Yet here he sat in a basement room, watching CIA analysts struggle with surveillance equipment that seemed designed to frustrate rather than illuminate. His talents wasted on equipment maintenance and shift rotations that ground away at his patience like sandpaper on skin. The analysts upstairs were serious men with university degrees and security clearances that weighed more than their personnel files. But Drayson could see what they refused to acknowledge, that their sophisticated reel-to-reel machines were losing the war one unprocessed frame at a time. He'd watched them hunched over viewing stations for 16-hour shifts, manually advancing footage with controls that clicked like typewriter keys, their notes filling ledgers with timestamps, and descriptions that would take weeks to cross-reference against other observations from different cameras across the city. The futility of it gnawed at him during the long night watches, when the building settled into silence and the hum of tape machines became a monotonous soundtrack to wasted effort. His frustration had grown sharp enough to cut by the time winter deepened and word came down of another network compromise. Good men extracted or buried because patterns hadn't been identified quickly enough to matter. Drayson had tried suggesting improvements to the analysis workflow, ideas born from his technical background and fresh perspective, but career intelligence officers had perfected the art of polite dismissal, smiling tightly while explaining that the system worked fine for those who understood its complexities. So he'd stopped suggesting and started observing, watching Soviet operatives move through the city like ghosts in the massive backlog of surveillance footage, their faces recurring in grainy images that sat in processing queues for weeks before anyone noticed the repetition. The anger that built in him wasn't the hot rage of youth, but something colder and more useful, the kind that sharpened focus rather than clouding it. He'd lie awake in his narrow bunk at the barracks, listening to the distant rumble of trains crossing between sectors at checkpoint stations, thinking about all that unprocessed footage sitting in storage rooms while enemy agents operated freely just beyond the wall. The system wasn't just slow, it was fundamentally broken, designed by people who'd never spent midnight shifts, watching opportunities slip away into bureaucratic procedures that valued protocol over results. Drayson wasn't a spy or an analyst, just a signals specialist who understood electronics and flow rates, but he could see the problem clearly enough. They were drowning in information while dying of thirst for actionable intelligence. The problem lived in room 204, a windowless space on the second floor, where the CIA's pride and joy hummed with mechanical confidence. 3 Model 7000 surveillance analysis machines that had cost more than most American families would earn in 10 lifetimes. Each machine occupied the footprint of a large desk, all brushed steel panels and precision-engineered tape mechanisms that required 2 weeks of training just to operate at basic competency. Their controls a bewildering array of knobs and switches that seemed designed by engineers who'd never considered that speed might matter more than technical perfection. Drayson had watched technicians from Langley spend 3 days installing just one of these machines, calibrating motor speeds and tension arms with jeweler's tools. While speaking in reverent tones about German optical components and NASA-grade magnetic heads, the machines could advance through footage at variable speeds, freeze frames with absolute precision, and output analysis data onto punch cards for computer processing. But their fatal flaw was brutally simple. They could only handle 1 reel at a time, and changing reels required a 15-minute threading process that brought analysis to a complete halt. The backlog that resulted from this bottleneck had metastasized into a crisis that no one would officially acknowledge. Metal shelving units in the basement storage area sagging under the weight of footage, waiting for analysis. Some reels, marked with dates now 3 months old. Drayson had done the arithmetic on a napkin during a night shift, calculating that at current processing rates, the 3 machines could handle roughly 18 hours of surveillance footage per day, while the network of cameras across West Berlin generated nearly 40 hours of material in the same period. The gap widened every single day, like a wound that wouldn't close, and everyone in signals intelligence knew what that meant. Somewhere in those unprocessed reels were the faces and patterns that could save lives or expose networks, information aging into irrelevance while analysts worked through their queues with methodical discipline. He'd seen career officers standing in that storage room with expressions of barely concealed despair, understanding that the enemy moved in real time while they operated in geological time, watching history through a delay that made action nearly impossible. The training requirements made everything worse because the machines were so complex and temperamental that only certified analysts could operate them without risking damage to the delicate mechanisms or the footage itself. Junior personnel like Drayson were forbidden from touching the equipment, reduced to changing coffee filters and maintaining logbooks, while trained analysts worked double shifts that left them hollow-eyed and irritable, their expertise trapped in a system that turned human intelligence into an industrial processing problem. He'd overheard conversations in the break room where analysts spoke in defeated tones about faces they'd recognized too late, patterns identified after the operational window had already closed, their professional frustration mixing with something darker, the knowledge that their sophisticated tools were failing the men in the field who depended on timely intelligence. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone with eyes to see it. The Soviet Union, with its reputation for technological backwardness, was somehow outmaneuvering an American intelligence apparatus drowning in its own expensive equipment. KGB operatives moving freely through the city, while Western analysts remained shackled to machines that prioritized precision over the only thing that actually mattered: speed. The breakthrough arrived wrapped in exhaustion and accident during a November night shift when Berlin's fog pressed against the listening post windows. Like something alive, Andresen had been awake for 19 hours straight, covering for an analyst out with pneumonia. He'd been organizing the archive room, a make-work task to stay conscious, when he knocked over a cardboard box that spilled surveillance footage reels across the concrete floor alongside his personal cassette tapes, the cheap consumer recordings he used to preserve letters from home that arrived on those fragile audio postcards his sister sent monthly. Sitting there on the cold floor, picking up the scattered materials, his fatigue-dulled mind made a connection that sobriety might have dismissed. The surveillance reels and the audio cassettes were both magnetic tape. Different formats, certainly, but the same fundamental technology. He found himself staring at his portable cassette recorder, a drugstore model that cost less than a week's pay, wondering with the kind of lateral thinking that only comes from sleep deprivation, whether footage could be dubbed onto audio tape and manipulated with the simple, mechanical controls he'd been using to speed through his sister's rambling updates about hometown gossip. The first experiment happened right there in the storage room, unauthorized and probably illegal by about 15 different regulations, using a cable assembly he improvised from spare parts in the electronics bin and his own hands shaking, slightly with the awareness that he was potentially destroying evidence in an active intelligence operation. He connected a small playback monitor to his cassette deck through the audio input, running the video signal as if it were sound, and dubbed 10 minutes of footage from a checkpoint camera onto a 90-minute tape, the magnetic particles, rearranging themselves to carry visual information in a format never intended for such purpose. When he played it back, the image was degraded, ghostly, and contrast poor, with horizontal lines rolling through the frame. But it was recognizable, and more importantly, his cassette player's simple mechanical controls let him fast forward at triple speed, while still maintaining enough image stability to identify faces and movements. What would have taken the Model 7000 machine's 40 minutes of careful threading and calibrated playback, he could scan in under 6 minutes using equipment that lived in teenagers' bedrooms across America, and he could stop, reverse, and restart with nothing more than plastic buttons that required no specialized training to master. He sat there in the storage room with his drugstore recorder and its tiny speaker crackling with the electromagnetic ghosts of surveillance footage, understanding with absolute clarity that he'd either discovered something genuinely important or completely lost his mind to exhaustion. The cassette in his hand represented hours of surveillance compressed onto a format so cheap and simple that intelligence services would never have considered it, their institutional thinking trapped in the assumption that expensive problems required expensive solutions. But the evidence played before his eyes at high speed, faces flickering past in rapid succession, the kind of pattern recognition scanning that human brains evolved to perform, and he could feel his pulse accelerating with the dangerous excitement of someone who'd stumbled onto something that shouldn't work, but absolutely did. By dawn, he'd dubbed 6 different surveillance reels onto cassettes and scanned through them all, his makeshift system crude and unsophisticated, but devastatingly effective for the one task that mattered most: quickly identifying whether footage contained anything worth the analyst's precious time on the proper machines. The technique was stupid, inelegant, probably violated every technical specification that Langley's engineers held sacred, but sitting there with his collection of labeled cassettes as morning light began penetrating the fog outside, Drayson understood he was holding something that could change the arithmetic of the Cold War surveillance game, assuming anyone would listen to a low-ranking signals specialist who'd just turned consumer. Electronics. into an intelligence tool. The ridicule began before Drayson even finished his presentation, standing in the cramped briefing room beneath flickering fluorescent lights that made everyone look corpse pale, while senior CIA officers sat with arms crossed like judges at an execution. Station Chief Morrison actually laughed when Drayson produced his drugstore cassette recorder. A sound without humor that echoed off concrete walls, painted that particular shade of institutional green that seemed designed to crush human spirit. And the other officers joined in with varying degrees of condescension that made Drayson's hands tremble as he held his collection of labeled tapes. They called it amateurish, beneath the dignity of professional intelligence work, the kind of garage workshop thinking that had no place in operations where American lives hung in the balance, and millions of dollars in sophisticated equipment represented the technological superiority that separated them from Soviet primitiveness. Morrison dismissed the entire demonstration with a wave that suggested swatting an irritating insect, explaining with forced patience that Langley didn't invest in the Model 7000 analysis machines, so enlisted personnel could circumvent proper procedure with children's toys. And Drayson felt his breakthrough dissolving into humiliation that burned in his chest like swallowed acid. But Captain Weber, a field officer with a scarred face and the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd operated behind the curtain, remained silent throughout the mockery, with eyes that suggested he was calculating something the others missed. He'd been running a surveillance operation on a suspected KGB courier for 3 months. Without breakthrough, burning through analyst hours and equipment time, while his target continued whatever mission Weber's instincts insisted was critical, and the case had become a source of bureaucratic frustration that made him willing to consider unconventional approaches that headquarters would never approve. When the other officers filed out, still chuckling about the cassette incident, Weber stayed behind, approaching Drayson with the careful movement of someone accustomed to environments where sudden gestures could prove fatal. His voice carried the flat affect of operational necessity when he spoke, no encouragement or praise, just the pragmatic calculation of a man playing odds. That institutional thinking would condemn as reckless. I've got 47 hours of checkpoint footage that needs analysis before my courier moves again, Weber said, producing a requisition sheet already filled with Drayson's name in handwriting that suggested this decision had been made during the presentation itself. My analysts won't get to it for another 2 weeks minimum, because headquarters keeps pulling them for priority cases. And by then, whatever network this bastard is servicing will have gone dormant or changed protocols. He set a box of surveillance reels on the table between them with the deliberate care of someone handling explosives, his expression revealing nothing, except perhaps a desperate man's willingness to trust a long shot when conventional methods had failed completely. You've got 72 hours to prove your tape trick works, Sergeant, and if you're wasting my time or contaminating evidence, I'll personally ensure your next posting involves counting supply requisitions in Greenland, where the only intelligence you'll gather concerns polar bear movements. Drayson accepted the box with hands that had stopped trembling, understanding that Weber was offering both opportunity and noose, a chance to prove his method against a real operation where failure would validate every dismissive laugh from the briefing room. The weight of the reels felt impossibly heavy, each one containing hours of footage that might hold patterns invisible to conventional analysis, or might contain nothing except his own desperation to matter in a war fought with shadows and magnetic tape. He met Weber's calculating stare and nodded once, the gesture carrying commitment that words would only diminish. Then carried his box of possibilities back to the storage room, where innovation and career suicide occupied the same uncertain territory, separated only by results that 72 hours would reveal. Drayson worked through the night in his converted storage room, the cassette recorder whirring like a mechanical heartbeat while Berlin's winter cold seeped through concrete walls and condensation formed on exposed pipes overhead. He'd transferred Weber's surveillance reels onto standard cassettes, creating a makeshift catalog system with timestamps scrawled on labels in handwriting that deteriorated as exhaustion set in and coffee stopped providing clarity. The footage showed a checkpoint on Friedrichstrasse, where thousands of faces passed daily, in that peculiar shuffle of people living under constant observation, their movements cautious and eyes averted in the universal body language of populations who understood that attention meant danger. Drayson played the tapes at double speed, then triple, watching humanity blur into frantic motion while his finger hovered over the pause button, waiting for repetition to emerge from chaos like constellations appearing in a darkening sky. By dawn of the second day, his eyes burned with the particular agony of staring too long at screens, his vision fragmenting into after-images that lingered when he blinked, but something had begun to emerge from the static. The same face appeared on 5 separate tapes across 14 days, always at different times, but following an identical route through the checkpoint, with the kind of consistency that could indicate either obsessive routine or operational necessity. Drayson isolated each appearance, marking the timestamps with trembling hands that understood significance before his conscious mind could articulate it, noticing details that conventional analysis would have missed in the frame-by-frame tedium. The man wore different clothes each time, but maintained the same gait, the same slight favor of his left leg that suggested an old injury, and he always carried a newspaper, folded in a specific way that Drayson recognized from training manuals as a signal method used for confirming meeting conditions. He rewound and replayed each sequence until the pattern became undeniable, a rhythm hidden in the noise like coded messages buried in radio static. And when he presented his findings to Weber with 6 hours remaining in his deadline, the evidence spooled out on cassette tape with devastating clarity. Weber studied the sequences in silence that stretched until Drayson wondered if he'd somehow misread everything, if pattern recognition born from desperation had created meaning where only coincidence existed. But then the captain reached for the telephone with movements that carried operational urgency, his scarred face transforming into something predatory as he began issuing instructions in the clipped language of field activation. Within hours, surveillance teams were positioned along the courier's route, and by nightfall, they'd followed him to an apartment in the French sector where 3 other suspected operatives maintained what appeared to be a communications hub serving networks that stretched across West Germany. The raid came just before midnight, executed with the precise violence of professionals who understood that hesitation in these situations meant casualties or burned intelligence. Weber called Drayson to the operations room. As reports filtered back through encrypted channels, his expression revealing something that might have been respect or might have been the grim satisfaction of a gamble that paid off against institutional odds. The cassette method had accomplished in 72 hours what $500,000 in analysis equipment couldn't achieve in months, proving that sometimes the Cold War's most valuable weapon wasn't sophisticated technology, but simply the ability to see patterns that others missed, while bureaucracy congratulated itself on expensive irrelevance. The cassette method spread through Western intelligence networks with the viral velocity of battlefield innovations that soldiers adopt. Because survival depends on practical solutions rather than institutional approval. By spring, listening posts across West Germany were requisitioning consumer tape recorders from local electronics shops, creating a bizarre procurement pattern that confused supply officers accustomed to million-dollar requisitions for equipment that required security clearances and technical specifications thick enough to stop bullets. A signals unit in Hamburg identified a dead drop operation using Drayson's technique, while a surveillance team in Frankfurt tracked a courier network that had operated invisibly for 18 months, their patterns suddenly obvious when viewed at speeds that transformed weeks of footage into hours of concentrated observation. The method's elegance lay in its accessibility, requiring nothing more than patience, basic recording equipment, and the kind of pattern recognition that good analysts possessed naturally but expensive machines somehow couldn't replicate, despite their sophisticated promise and government contract price tags. CIA headquarters received reports with the uncomfortable recognition that field operatives were achieving results using technology purchased at the same stores that sold toasters and transistor radios to housewives shopping for kitchen conveniences. Langley analysts drafted memos attempting to systematize Drayson's approach into official doctrine, but their efforts produced documentation that somehow made the simple, complicated, transforming intuitive observation into bureaucratic process that required approval chains and standardized procedures. Meanwhile, stations from Munich to Bonn were already running their own variations, each adaptation reflecting local needs and the particular genius of operators who understood that Cold War victory often belonged to whoever could improvise fastest when doctrine failed. The institutional pride that had invested fortunes in reel-to-reel analysis machines now faced the humbling reality that a sergeant's midnight desperation had outperformed years of research and development, proving once again that warfare's most reliable constant was the gap between what headquarters imagined and what actually worked when lives depended on results rather than reputation. By autumn, NATO intelligence coordination meetings included quiet discussions of the cassette protocol, though no official designation existed, and training manuals still featured the expensive equipment gathering dust in climate-controlled facilities. Drayson himself received a commendation that came with restrictions against discussing methods publicly, the military's way of acknowledging innovation while maintaining the fiction that billion-dollar intelligence apparatus hadn't been outmaneuvered by consumer electronics. The Soviets knew something had shifted in Western surveillance capabilities, but attributed it to technological breakthrough rather than elegant simplicity, their own bureaucracy unable to imagine that advantage could come from anything except complexity and expense. The first indication that something had changed in Western surveillance capabilities arrived not through intercepted communications or captured documents, but through the behavioral shifts of Soviet operatives who suddenly moved through Berlin's grey streets with the nervous caution of animals sensing an invisible predator. Colonel Vasily Petrov of the KGB's Second Chief Directorate noticed it during a routine review of agent reports in early 1979, when 3 separate couriers mentioned feeling exposed during drops that should have been routine, their instincts detecting surveillance pressure that technical sweeps couldn't confirm. The pattern troubled Petrov because good intelligence officers learned to trust operational intuition over reassuring technology, and when multiple trained agents reported the same phantom presence, it meant Western capabilities had evolved in ways that Soviet countermeasures hadn't anticipated. He ordered a comprehensive review of tradecraft across West German operations, searching for the vulnerability that logic said existed, but evidence refused to reveal, knowing that unseen threats were more dangerous than identified ones, because you couldn't defend against what you couldn't understand. Moscow Center received Petrov's concerns with the bureaucratic skepticism that headquarters always applied to field anxieties, their analysts suggesting that increased caution reflected Western psychological operations rather than genuine capability improvements. But operational reality told different stories as dead drops were discovered, with timing that suggested pattern recognition beyond normal surveillance rhythms. And courier networks that had operated successfully for years suddenly found themselves compromised through methods that left no trace of how exposure had occurred. Soviet technical teams examined captured Western equipment but found nothing revolutionary. No breakthrough in camera technology or computing power that would explain the sudden shift in detection capabilities. The mystery deepened when interrogation of a turned Western intelligence officer revealed no knowledge of new surveillance systems, only vague references to improved analysis methods that he couldn't detail because field operatives never understood what headquarters did with the raw footage they collected. Petrov implemented emergency protocols that transformed Soviet operations across West Germany, ordering agents to abandon established patterns and adopt randomized schedules that sacrificed efficiency for unpredictability. Couriers who had walked the same routes for months now took different paths daily, meeting locations changed with each contact, and dead drops were abandoned after single use instead of the repeated utilization that operational economy usually demanded. The countermeasures worked, but at devastating cost to intelligence gathering, as the very unpredictability that defeated pattern recognition also reduced operational effectiveness by half, turning what had been elegant spy networks into chaotic improvisations that generated less information while consuming more resources. Soviet handlers watched their carefully constructed operations deteriorate into reactive scrambling, knowing they were defending against a threat they couldn't see, fighting an enemy innovation that remained maddeningly invisible even as its effects reshaped the entire espionage landscape. The irony that would remain hidden for decades was that Soviet countermeasures assumed Western breakthrough reflected the technological sophistication that their own system valued, never imagining that their tradecraft was being defeated by equipment purchased in the same shops where East German refugees bought their first taste of Western consumer abundance. KGB analysts produced reports speculating about artificial intelligence prototypes and advanced computing systems, their institutional mindset unable to conceive that advantage could emerge from simplicity rather than complexity. Meanwhile, in West Berlin, Dresen continued his shifts with cassette recorders that cost less than a good dinner, watching Soviet operations twist themselves into increasingly complicated patterns that made them easier rather than harder to track, proof that sometimes the most effective deception was allowing your enemy to outsmart themselves through assumptions about your capabilities that were far more sophisticated than unglamorous reality. The memorandum arrived on William Hendrick's desk at CIA headquarters in Langley on a Tuesday morning in early 1980. A field report from Berlin detailing surveillance successes achieved through what the document described with embarrassing vagueness as improvised technical methods requiring minimal equipment investment. Hendricks, who had spent 18 months justifying budget allocations for the agency's automated image analysis system, a room-sized apparatus that cost more than $500,000 and required 3 trained technicians to operate, read the report with growing unease that had nothing to do with Soviet capabilities and everything to do with internal political exposure. The Berlin station's casual mention that a signal sergeant using consumer cassette recorders had identified more surveillance patterns in 6 months than headquarters' sophisticated machinery had found all year represented the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that ended careers, not because the agency had failed, but because it had succeeded expensively while someone else succeeded cheaply. Hendricks understood immediately that this wasn't an intelligence problem, but a perception crisis, because congressional oversight committees would inevitably ask why taxpayers had funded elaborate systems when Radio Shack technology apparently worked better, and no amount of technical explanation would satisfy. Politicians who measured success in dollar efficiency rather than operational complexity. The institutional response moved through Langley's corridors with the self-protective instinct that large organizations developed when threatened by inconvenient innovation, not through conspiracy, but through the organic resistance that bureaucracies mounted against anything exposing their established investments as potentially wasteful. Senior analysts produced position papers explaining that Drayson's method worked only in specific circumstances with particular types of footage, that it couldn't replace comprehensive analysis systems, that field expedients shouldn't be confused with headquarters rigor. The arguments were technically accurate but strategically defensive, coming from departments whose budgets and prestige depended on maintaining the narrative that sophisticated problems required sophisticated solutions purchased through sophisticated procurement processes. Meanwhile, procurement officers who had spent years cultivating relationships with defense contractors now faced awkward questions about why those contractors' expensive surveillance equipment was being outperformed by devices teenagers used to record music off the radio, creating resentment that flowed downward through chains of command toward the sergeant whose ingenuity had become everyone else's problem. The compromise that emerged reflected bureaucratic rather than operational logic, with headquarters quietly adopting simplified analysis techniques in field stations, while publicly maintaining that primary intelligence work still required advanced systems worthy of continued funding. Drayson's method was reclassified as supplementary field expedience rather than primary methodology, allowing the agency to benefit from his innovation while protecting the budget allocations that sustained headquarters' empire. Official training materials made no mention of cassette recorders, instead describing expedited review protocols that field officers understood meant exactly what they'd been doing unofficially for months, the gap between formal doctrine and practical reality growing into the kind of open secret that everyone acknowledged privately while maintaining public fictions. The careful language preserved institutional dignity while tacitly admitting that sometimes a sharp-eyed sergeant with cheap equipment could see what expensive machines and credentialed analysts missed, though that admission would never appear in any document that congressional committees might read. Field operatives watched this bureaucratic theater with the weary cynicism of people who understood that headquarters lived in different reality than those working contested ground, where results mattered more than process and effectiveness trumped procedural elegance. They continued using Drayson's techniques regardless of what official policy stated, knowing that career intelligence officers learned early to distinguish between what the organization claimed it did and what actually worked, when lives depended on accurate information rather than proper forms. By 1982, Sergeant Michael Drayson had rotated back to Fort Meade with a commendation letter and a chest full of medals that never mentioned cassette recorders. The official citations praising his analytical initiative in language so deliberately vague that no one reading them would understand what he'd actually accomplished. He worked now in a training capacity, teaching new signals specialist techniques that appeared nowhere in formal curriculum but were whispered about in break rooms and passed along through the informal networks where real knowledge traveled. The young recruits who sat in his unofficial sessions understood they were learning something valuable precisely because it existed outside official channels, their notebooks filling with methods that would never appear on examinations, but might save lives when they reached their own listening posts in divided cities where the Cold War remained lethally real. Drayson noticed how the agency had simultaneously absorbed and erased his contribution, incorporating his methods while ensuring no paper trail existed that might embarrass procurement departments or justify budget reductions, and he felt neither pride nor resentment about this bureaucratic disappearing act, only the tired acceptance of someone who'd learned that institutions protected themselves first and credited individuals never. The NATO intelligence community continued using variations of what field operatives still called the Drayson method, though headquarters documents referred to it through sanitized terminology that obscured its origins in consumer electronics and individual initiative. Listening posts from Hamburg to Athens kept cassette Recorders alongside their official equipment, the cheap plastic devices doing work that million-dollar systems couldn't match for pattern recognition in high-volume surveillance footage. The Soviets never determined exactly what had changed in Western analysis capabilities, their counterintelligence reports speculating about artificial intelligence breakthroughs and quantum computing advances, while the actual answer sat in hundreds of field offices playing back Radio Shack tapes at double speed. The KGB responded by making their operatives' movements more random and less patterned, inadvertently confirming that something had shifted in the intelligence balance, their adaptation to phantom technology, creating real operational difficulties that limited their effectiveness throughout the early 80s. The irony wasn't lost on veterans who remembered when the Cold War's technological race seemed to favor whichever side built the most sophisticated machinery, the biggest computers, the most advanced surveillance systems that cost fortunes and required specialists to operate. Drayson's accidental discovery had proven what field operatives always suspected, that human observation combined with simple tools often outperformed elaborate equipment designed by people who'd never worked actual intelligence operations. The lesson spread quietly through the community, never formally acknowledged but deeply understood, that institutional investment in complexity sometimes blinded organizations to elegant simplicity, and that the most valuable innovations often came from people frustrated enough to ignore proper procedures and try something stupidly obvious. The cassette recorders eventually became obsolete as video technology advanced, but the principle survived. The understanding that expensive sophistication wasn't always superior to cheap ingenuity, and that sometimes the balance of power shifted not through breakthroughs in laboratories, but through one observant person noticing what everyone else had overcomplicated. The Berlin Wall would stand another 7 years before falling. But in listening posts and field stations throughout those years, intelligence officers continued using methods that began with the bored sergeant's late-night experimentation, proving that in the shadowy arithmetic of espionage, simple multiplication sometimes outperformed complex equations. Drayson retired in 1988, his personnel file containing nothing about his most significant contribution, the cassette recorders long since replaced by digital systems that were themselves destined for obsolescence, but the principle enduring in the institutional memory of people who understood that Cold War victories came not just from superior technology, but from individuals willing to question whether the emperor's expensive clothes actually fit better than something bought off the shelf. What simple solution might be hiding in plain sight that could change everything in your own field? Subscribe to discover more stories where ordinary people shifted the balance of power through extraordinary observation.